you need a PhD in a problem. You can get by with an associate's degree in a solution. And that's kind of boring. But actually, that's the point. The person really wants the solution.
It takes a lot to start a company, grow a company, sell a company. But it takes even more than that to do this multiple times over. Mark DeSantis is a successful entrepreneur here in Pittsburgh, and we're going to be sitting down with him to explore everything from his journey in entrepreneurship to what makes the Pittsburgh community such a great place to start and grow a business. I think the only appropriate way to start is to say, well, congratulations on the recent sale of Bloomfield Robotics to Kubota. That's
Kubota Corporation.
Kubota. Of course I was going to say
Everybody
it
does
at the
that.
start. Yeah, I was looking. I thought I had it in mind.
No, Kubota, yeah.
But this is not the first time you've sold a company, and it sounds like it might not be the last either.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's funny. Some people, it's almost like an affliction, but I think at some level I can relate to people with addictions to gambling, maybe a little bit.
Okay.
Because in one sense it is gambling. You are taking big risks. Even if you've done it a few times, you think, well, now that I have this experience, I'm better at this. And the reality is there are still uncertainties that you can't account for in addition to the risks. And I'm always careful to make that distinction because I have experience building companies, which allows me to manage risk when I see them, whether it's funding or hiring or tech development. But I also have never been able to control for, and never will be able to control for, the uncertainty that exists in the world. And that's where I think most entrepreneurs struggle is, and frankly, I think that's where burnout happens is, it's this living with uncertainty that's the challenge. So once you come to terms with that and you say, this is my life, then it becomes something, a joy, a pleasure.
What did you do to become uncomfortable with that uncertainty?
How did I get used to it?
Yeah.
I think if you do it enough, but also you come to accept it, it's almost Zen-like. You have to accept your mortality. Now, this is going to get a little weird, but I'm going to digress.
Go for it. Yeah.
So my dad was a veteran of World War II, and he was in the Pacific. He was a Marine. My father never talked about the war, ever. Just something that generation never did talk about. But one time he did, and I think I was a sophomore home for the summer, and I came home late. He was watching some kind of horror movie, and he talked about fear. He was a corpsman, which meant he had to go get soldiers when they were injured, essentially pull them out of the line of fire and save them. Unfortunately, he was on Iwo Jima, which is, if you know the flag raising, that famous battle. It was a terrible battle. 7,000 Marines, soldiers, and sailors died. 21,000 Japanese died. Small little island. He was on the first wave. He was 18. He landed with 150 men. At the end of the second day, there were 4 of them alive. And he said, Mark, if you know fear, the idea of frozen with fear is you are so afraid that you can't move. Because he was so afraid of dying, because all his friends had died within a day, he couldn't move. And people were calling his name, asking him to come get them. He was so afraid of dying, but he reached a point where he knew he was going to die there. He accepted he was not getting off that island. Now, obviously did, I'm here, but he knew he was not going to get off that island. When he knew he was going to die, he could do his job. And you may think, what in the world does that have to do with entrepreneurship? And one of the things I came to terms with is quite probably I would fail. But if I'm going to fail, I'm going to fail trying. I'm not going to spend my time worrying about making wrong choices or bad choices. I'm just going to make choices. And the gods will either smile on me or they won't. I can't control that. And so once you come to terms with the fact that when you do this entrepreneurial game, and the likelihood is that you will fail, it releases a whole lot of energy that allows you to make the decisions and make the choices that every entrepreneur needs to make, and bring the creativity that every entrepreneur needs to bring to be successful. If you're frozen with fear because you're worried about the failure of the company, or frankly your personal failure and the humiliation that that might bring, you're not going to make good decisions. You're going to fail. It's like playing not to lose in sports. In my mind, entrepreneurship's all offense, no defense. I had a friend, a professor at CMU, who said that one time he got a bunch of money, a bunch of venture money, and he was not really spending the money. And another friend of mine met him, and he said, "What's the problem here? You just got funded, and you're not really making any investments." And the professor said, "Well, I have a hedging strategy." And he says, "You're a professor at CMU. You should know this. Do you know what hedging means? Hedging is for people that already have wealth who are trying to preserve it.
Yeah.
You have nothing. You have nothing to lose, which should release you and from the constraint that you're worried about losing."
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of entrepreneurship. It's a beautiful thing when you accept that, in a sense, Zen-like, accept your death. In a not a literal sense, but in a figurative sense. At that point, you become a dangerous entrepreneur. You actually might win.
No kidding. I appreciate you being so open with that story. And you said a lot of things that stick out, but to bring this into your story, you mentioned how it kind of frees you once you accept that you're more likely to fail than you are to succeed.
Yeah.
How then do you channel that energy that you described in the right direction to start doing the things that allow you to be successful? And feel free to share this in the context of any of the multiple companies.
It's funny. I think what a lot of people struggle with, first-time entrepreneurs, and I have the greatest empathy, maybe even borderline sympathy for people who've never done it before, who are doing it for the first time, because it is frightening. And one of the things that I think where people get hung up is not unlike perhaps somebody climbed Mount Everest. I've never climbed Mount Everest, but read stories about it, and I have a friend that did. And he said, when you climb Mount Everest, it takes forever just to get to base camp.
Because you spend like 3 weeks there before you're even allowed to go up after that. Yeah.
And so one of the things that hurts people is they keep looking at the summit. And they should really look at 12 feet in front of them. And so for a lot of entrepreneurs, you want to keep your sort of, Martin Luther King, keep your eyes on the horizon. Mm-hmm. You keep your eyes on the horizon, but you don't obsess about it. You focus on the here and now. And that's where it's challenging for entrepreneurs. You have to live in sort of two planes. You have to, every day, think about the long term, act towards the long term, but also function in the here and now. And that's hard. Mm-hmm. That's hard because you're in these two planes, and you're hopping back and forth. Mm-hmm. You're organizing things now, every day, so that you're advantaged when you raise your first round of capital, get your first customer, find your first partner, hire a CTO. You're organizing yourself so that you're ready for that when that happens 6 months, a year, year and a half, 2 years from now. But at the same time, you got to get work done.
Yeah.
Lights got to be on, people got to be paid, tech has to be built, fingers have to be on keys, all that. And managing those two things, or at least organizing those, architecting those two things simultaneously, and then having them be in some sort of, being synchronized, is hard. It's very hard. But I say to people, if you're not into that, don't do it.
Yeah.
Like, you have to be into that.
Yeah.
Like, that has to not be a burden. Mm-hmm. If it's a burden, then I say to you,
What allowed you to enjoy the journey. Very simply put, right? Focusing on the day-to-day without getting distracted by looking ahead at the summit of many
I think
others.
I think the first thing I said, which was the not worrying about what the ultimate outcome is, and let me be. This is a tricky thing when I say that. I can think of some of my prior investors thinking, "What the hell? I gave you all this. You're just sitting around like you don't care if
This is one of the beauties of doing this 20 years,
right.
10 years after the fact.
I gave you that money and you don't even care if you succeed." No, it's not about that. It's more the case of, hey, this is what I signed up for. I'm all in on this. So there is an element of that saying, of not getting so caught up in what's the downside, but just dealing with how do we win, not how do we avoid losing. I think that was one way to, but I think every entrepreneur has to find that thing that is most satisfying to them. Mm-hmm. So for me, it took me years to kind of find that place where I was truly satisfied, which was to have young people. There's a unique aspect of entrepreneurship people don't think about. They think about, well, I'm going to get rich. A friend of mine calls it foosballs and Ferraris. I'm going to get that's the target. That's why I'm here, and I don't think that's why most entrepreneurs do it. But each entrepreneur has to find that thing that is particularly most satisfying about that journey. For me, it was creating opportunities for young people to have responsibility, unlike they'd ever had. Maybe they wouldn't get it for another 10 years if they went to go work for XYZ company. Is to give them opportunities to do things they would never ordinarily have access to. And then getting the hell out of their way and letting them succeed even when they fall. Mm-hmm. Letting them make those mistakes and see them grow. That ultimately became one of the more satisfying things about doing this. Some people really like the creative aspect of it. They're creating something from nothing. They're artists. Mm-hmm. I mean, the people that occupy this building, many of them are artists. They work in numbers and math and code, but they're still artists, not unlike Michelangelo or Van Gogh. Some people get into it in that way. Some people like the crazy journey. They're just nutty people that want to climb K2. 1 in 4 people that try die, but I'm cool with that. Some people like that kind of just the raw nature of. I think for every entrepreneur, they have to find out what is satisfying, and I think another beautiful thing about it, if you let it wash over you, is that you discover things about yourself. Mm-hmm. Versus if you're hiding or fearful, you don't acquire a lot of self-knowledge that way. If you put yourself out there and let the world have at you and put your jaw out there and say, give me your best shot, you learn things about yourself you would not normally learn. That self-knowledge allows you to then ask the question, what is satisfying to me? Why am I here? Mm-hmm. I sound like Dr. Phil right now, don't I?
No. You're saying a lot of great things. I'm going to weave this into your story a little bit. The cliche way I could ask this next question is, how did you get started in entrepreneurship? But maybe a different way I might put a spin on it. You can answer this whichever way you want. Yeah. When was there a moment, whether it was before you started a company, in the middle of having started a company, that you were like, this is for me, and if I can continue to succeed, I'm going to do this forever?
Yeah, wow. Yeah, that's a great one. I think it was the first time, this goes back to like 2010 or 9. It's the first time I got a significant investor. Now, I would say this as a caveat to those entrepreneurs out there listening. I don't celebrate raising money. It's just a fact. It's just sort of a thing you do.
It's an obligation. Yeah, it's the way I've heard it. It's not the finish line. No, it's like now you are obligated to do this.
Not even close. But what was satisfying is we had started a company, raised a little bit of money, had 13 employees, ran out of money, had to let everybody go, hadn't paid our landlord in 18 months, and that was a good day, right? It was bad. Things were bad. We'd been at it as first-time entrepreneur. And my co-founder and I walked around the block when we were in this dire situation, and he started talking about really pivoting the company. And I was like, pivoting the company? I'm worried about bankruptcy. and you're pivoting the company. And we ended up starting that conversation, which allowed us to then rethink everything we did. We ended up raising significant money. All the investors retained shares of equity in their company, in our company, and we were off and running. When I got that first tranche of capital, which came from General Electric, I thought, wow, I can do this. Wow. I mean, at that time it was the biggest industrial company in the world, and they're like, there's these jamokes in Pittsburgh, and there was the only company they ever invested in Pittsburgh.
Really?
Yeah. And they're like, it was like, they tapped us, one of the gods just said, here. They tapped us on the head. And at that point, I realized, I don't know what's going to happen with this company, but I know one thing. This is what I want to do the rest of my life.
Yeah. I
can do this. And the feeling I had was, I can't explain it. We were at death's door. I mean, we were done. We were finished. We were so bad off that if you came near me, you were in debt just being within a 20-foot radius of me. Like, it was bad. We were a black hole of dark energy. And we climbed out of that hole when we ourselves didn't think we could do it. And I thought, this is the game I want to be in. Now, as time fast forward and I joined other companies, you have your ups and downs, but that's really was the moment that I said, yeah, this is what I want to do.
Where did you, when you were starting organizations, right? You started and sold an electricity trading hedge fund.
Yeah.
You've done Robotics that sold to Michigan.
Michelin,
Michelin. I can't believe I said
Though we had customers in Michigan, Detroit being our
biggest. That's fair. I get it. Yeah, cars. I see where I slipped up on that.
Yeah.
Bloomfield Robotics as well.
Yeah.
What did you do? What was there a common thread at the start of these companies where you, how did you identify the problem that you're like, I'm going to make it my mission to solve this?
Well, I've been teaching at Carnegie Mellon now for 20 plus years, and so I had this, I would call it loose affiliation as an adjunct professor. Mm-hmm. So I knew that this was just a big toy store for me. CMU is filled with all sorts of amazing, fun things.
Were you teaching before or after you started?
Before.
Before, okay. Before. All right, interesting.
And I thought, toy store, can these toys have use in the real world?
Yeah.
But then I thought, I'm not one of these people that's keeps up with the latest tech trend. It's on, TechCrunch or Crunchbase or Crunch or whatever. And I'm more along the lines of, and I think this is where technology, particularly AI, can make a difference, is in the big and boring problems. The places where nobody thinks to take an advanced technology. Mm-hmm. And it started with, we're first companies in the defense space, solving a really simple problem of if somebody has to go into a building and it's a war zone, do I know if there's a bad guy on the other side of the wall? And that was our first sort of attempt. I moved to how do you sell electricity? How do you price electricity in electricity markets in the United States? Turns out that's an enormously complicated problem, but it's also the largest commodity market in the world. So we applied our machine learning to this boring problem that's a backwater that people think of utilities, and it worked. And then we said this advanced AI could be applied to something as simple as maintaining our streets. And our customers are public works departments in big cities.
Yeah.
People thought, what? And I remember I would initially talk to investors, and they're going, you're going to sell what to who? Mm-hmm. And I'm like, no, this is a problem. We have insurance companies in the United States will say that we spend about $100 billion a year nationally on car repairs that are a function of bad roads, not bad cars.
Yeah.
The city of San Francisco, right, probably now needs to spend about $2.5 billion just to get their streets up to minimum national standards. So big problem, but nobody thinks about it in terms of a tech solution. Same thing with in agriculture. So if there's a threat, it was go where everyone else isn't with advanced solutions and make sure the problem's big enough where you can make a difference.
This is a question that I think really applies to this podcast, right? Because we're a tech-focused, like manufacturing, hard tech podcast, if you will. How do you take robotics to market versus something else, right? Like this is an area where, you know, I like the way you describe kind of the commonalities across the problems that you're seeing. You're seeing areas where no one else is running to, but I've got to think, you know, doing something with a hard tech solution, it's hard.
I think that's a like a big question, and I think it's a challenging one, and I've thought about this a lot. So what I've utilized is robotic technology. So I've never built a robot butler, and probably likely never will. And the analogy I would use as to where robotics is, and it's imperfect, but it's the best one I can think of. I love business history and the history of technology, and the closest analog I can think to where robots are is, and you could even equate Pittsburgh to Detroit, circa 1905.
Okay.
So right around 1905 in Detroit, before the auto industry exploded, there were about 300 auto manufacturers, 300 in Detroit alone. And what were they doing? They were using the most advanced technologies that were available in 1905 to try to build automobiles. And they were building custom cars, or they might have a dozen cars built. And these were quite expensive, affordable by only a few, quite sophisticated, quite complex. But there was no Henry Ford yet. And in a sense, robots are at that stage. I believe there will be a Henry Ford. Now, I'm not a big fan of Henry Ford as a person.
Sure, that's fair.
But there'll be an equivalent version of him in robots, and multiple versions of a Henry Ford in the following sense. He said, look, my mission is to allow anyone to afford a car. But that car, in order for anyone to want to purchase it and rely on as a source of transportation, has to be reliable, in addition to being affordable and serviceable. And so he said, well, how do I do that? Well, my innovation is not the automobile, although he did come up with some interesting innovations in the automobile, but nothing spectacular. My innovation is how to get there. So he looked at what was happening in different industries and how they made lots of stuff and said something like an assembly line will allow me to build a car reliably and affordably and get out of the business of making cars for rich people.
Sure.
And so he did. And interestingly, his strategy was such that every advance in that manufacturing had him lower the price of a car. And ultimately, he became the richest person in the world, and there, within 10 years or so, 12, 15 years, founding, 30 million Americans were driving cars. What does that have to do with robots? I think that there's a point at which robot technology will advance as it is now, but I think it will advance around the ability to propagate robots, not necessarily some clever advance in the robotic technology. I think most of the technologies that make robots right now probably been created. I think there'll be advances in material science, perhaps processing, energy storage, that'll certainly make robots easier, more prevalent. But what needs to happen is, how do you get from, fancy robots for a few rich and propagate it so that, hey, these robots are making a difference for the rest of us. When somebody figures out that, then you're going to see an explosive growth in the industry.
Yeah, what I hear from that answer is, it's like Henry Ford didn't revolutionize the car. He revolutionized the factory that made the car.
Right.
Now, I look at some of the businesses you've started as just
applied robotics, right? You find
Yeah.
a really good niche,
Yeah.
and that's where you
Right.
double down.
Right.
So, maybe this is a good opportunity to talk about Bloomfield
Yeah.
Robotics. This was not your first soiree
No,
starting
no.
a company. So
No.
tell us a bit of the origin story
Yeah.
there, how you identified the
Yeah.
problem, how you decided to pursue this.
So I became what you might call a near founder is how I describe it. So there's two guys, Dr. George Cantor, who's a research scientist still at Carnegie Mellon, and one of his grad students, Tim Muller-Siv, who's a mechanical engineer. Tim and George had been working on research projects related to how can I use robotic technology on a farm to solve things like the labor problem, monitoring crops, and they had built something called a Robotics, which was a small robot that literally would autonomously move up and down rows, monitor the crops, even had a little robot arm that could sort of touch the plant, do some clever things to it. And they had been working on this for probably a year or two before I met them. And somebody had said to me, and I was kind of between stuff, and said, hey, you did some robot stuff with your previous company. Go talk to George and Tim. And I didn't know George and Tim at all. And I sat down with them in a conference room, not just like this, and they were ready to do a presentation. And they had and I actually didn't even know what they were doing. I didn't know what their technology was. I just knew they were doing something interesting. And they had a slide, and on the slide it had a grape. And for those who know AI, it was in what's called a bounding box, and a little box around the grape. And I looked at it before they said anything else. I said, I'm in.
Yeah.
And they said, well, but we haven't even. I said, no, I know what you're doing. I'm gonna speculate.
Is this because you had enough experience up to this point to see
I had
good
success
idea?
with a AI doing in a sense, augmenting, in some cases, replacing human inspection. The way roads were, and this is changing now, but the way roads are inspected is, two people get in a truck. Oh yeah, that's fine. The reliability of that, is questionable.
Sure.
When you bring some machines and AI, and the whole world changes. And so I had experience doing that. And I realized, I said, look, you're going to inspect crops. You're going to inspect crops just like I was a 10-year-old kid, following my Italian immigrant grandfather in his 1-acre garden. And I remember as a little kid, he was looking at the tomatoes, touching them, squeezing them, pulling leaves, doing all sorts of things. This is common practice in massive specialty crop farms, fruits and vegetables around the world. So I had knowledge of that. I had knowledge of being able to use AI to inspect those things. And I thought, I get it. You're going to inspect every plant, probably geolocate that plant because you're going to inspect it again and again. And they're like, and they looked at each other like, what? I said, I'm in. I get it. You don't have to pitch me. I get it. I knew immediately this is what I wanted to do. I signed on as an advisor. A month later, I'm CEO. And then 2 weeks after that, they said, Mark, we don't have any money, so you have to go.
Lucky they got you. You've done this before.
You have to go get money to pay yourself and then pay us. So I'm like, that's cool. So we ended up raising, I think, in the end, about $16 million over a period of 5 years. We sold the company within 5 years. So they were great guys to work with. They were brilliant. I didn't originate the idea. I just sort of helped them along and moved the ball down the field. We had the good fortune of being in Pittsburgh. Carnegie Mellon, I'll just say this, it's for those who know the university, it is the leading AI university in the world. Sorry, Stanford and MIT, but that's the truth. And as a consequence of that, we have some of the brightest people in the world that you can get to join your company. You don't need to go to Silicon Valley for that. Money is mobile. That's one of the other things I learned. It used to be back in the day, 20 years ago, if you went to Boise, Idaho, or Chicago, or wherever, all your money had to come locally, and there wasn't much of it for venture. And now, people just get on an airplane. How about that? Or use Zoom. We started our company in the teeth of COVID. I would recommend to people, if there is a pandemic, don't start a company, but, But the point being is we did, and we survived. So the world has changed for that. So you don't have to be near the capital. Capital will find you. That's good news for anybody anywhere in the world that's starting a company. We learned that, and when you do, if you can locate yourself next to a Carnegie Mellon, capital will find you. You build your company right here in River City.
Yeah. I have another question, because you're giving really good tactical advice on being successful starting a company. I think for our audience,
I can give advice on being unsuccessful.
Well, we'll get a failure story before this is over. Don't you worry. But I do want to ask another question on how to be successful, because our audience watching Made Here, listening to Manufacturing Happy Hour, a big question they have is, how do you make robotics commercially viable? Yeah. So I think this would be a question for you, since you've kind of done this with a couple companies.
So one of the things that we were, I wish we had done more of this in my previous companies, but we certainly did a lot of it in this company. There's a guy, Steve Blank, he teaches at Stanford, and he's well known amongst people that sort of follow entrepreneurship and techniques that can help entrepreneurs. And he basically said, look, a lot of entrepreneurs start with what they think is a solution when it's just a hammer looking for nails, as cliche goes. What you really ought to understand is, why don't you take that hammer that you have and put it on the shelf for the moment, forget about it, and just focus on looking at nails. Imagine you don't have a hammer, and just, probably extended that analogy as far as it could go. But the point being is, understand the problem. And so what we did is we talked to farmers. We had a notion that farmers would use this technology. So we just got our boots dirty and went to vineyards and blueberry farms and what you name it, greenhouses, and talked to farmers, and didn't say, one thing we avoided was, if you had this, would you buy it? And what I learned in my previous companies is, young, ambitious people come in and
that's the question they
say,
ask.
we have this magic box, and would you buy it? And most people are going to say, well, sure, I'd buy it. You bet. Good luck. And then if you came back in 2 years with the magic box fully built, they'd say, nah, maybe not.
Yeah.
In other words, it's not, you want what you've done when you sit with somebody with a machine or a box across a table and say, would you buy it? What you've done is they come around to your side of the table and become co-creators, because they're doing you a favor. You absolutely don't want that. You want objective opinions about the problem you're trying to solve.
Yeah.
You actually, to take it in science terms, you want to prove the null hypothesis. If you're a scientist, you want to prove that there's no relationship between what you think is true and the actual problem. So you're actually trying to overcome your own prejudices and biases about what you think the solution should be.
Yeah. Very interesting.
And that takes a lot of guts and a sort of a certain mindset. Once you've done that and you've talked to enough farmers, in our case, we were saying, is inspection that important? Initially, we're like, uh-oh. And I was like, I was getting responses like, uh-oh, not important. But then I started to dig a little further, and I say, what do you think I mean by inspection? And that's when things got interesting. And one of the things that I discovered, because what we did is have a camera, 2 lenses, its own light source, essentially images every plant as it's moving and hung on a vehicle of any sort, ATVs, tractors, what have you, geolocates that plant, and then literally he's counting grapes, sizing grapes, color, leaf density, all that wonderful stuff. We had an idea that would be useful. We asked them, what do you consider inspection? And what I came away with is, it was interesting. The way they inspected is they would have somebody, a viticulturalist, if you're in a vineyard, a viniculturalist, they would inspect about 1/10 of an acre. It takes about 150 vines. It would take a viniculturist basically all day to do that. It's 1/10 of an acre. Even the smallest vineyards are 100 acres. We had customers at 100,000 acres. And one of the dark truths that I learned about it is they never thought about inspection as an important activity because it really wasn't possible. and that they were guessing.
Yeah, that makes sense.
They were guessing as to the condition of their crops. And they were factoring that into their harvesting, their irrigation. They were just saying, well, we think this is true, so do this. Once we started to get through that, and we discovered that, and started to convey in a subtle way that maybe that problem could be solved. And by the way, satellites and drones had been used to look at farms. In specialty crops, you have thick canopies, so it's not as useful. If I'm looking at corn, that's one thing. If I'm looking at vines in a vineyard or blueberry bushes, not as useful. And so once they started to realize, oh, I can inspect everything all the time, and if it's on a vehicle that's already pushing or pulling something, I can do it nearly costlessly. That's when the wheels started to turn for us and them. So we arrived at that place of value, as I like to say, together.
Yeah. I'm going to paraphrase this a little bit just because I want to make sure everyone gets the point you made. And I'm probably not going to actually get it perfectly, but the way I see it, a lot of entrepreneurs or young companies, they're in love with their solution. They're not necessarily in love with the problem. Would you say part of this is being more in love with the problem?
Well, I used to say, so when I teach this too, and I say this to my students, and I absolutely mean it from the depths of my very soul. You need a PhD in a problem. You can get by with an associate's degree in a solution. And this is frustrating for people that are technologists because they want to show their skills, and I don't blame them. I mean, they've spent their lives dedicated to making magic, and often what's required is not magic. It's sort of half magic, sort of.
Yeah.
It's just often quite mundane applications of technologies in clever, thoughtful ways, and that's kind of boring. But actually, that's the point. Is the person really wants the solution. Everybody that worked in our company, we had 40, when we sold the company, we had 40 plus employees. Everybody got their boots dirty. I mean, literally, like they would go and work in a farm in France or California or Peru or wherever we had
These
customers.
don't sound like the worst places to go. To be fair, I would get my boots dirty for that too.
And and people would, you had software engineers, driving ATVs, and I mean, it just to experience that. What would ultimately happen is people had these, people would have fantastical. We need to get this kind of sensor with and then they're like, well, maybe we don't need to do that. Maybe we just tweak what we have. And once you get what I call this, to borrow from famous Carnegie Mellon, Herb Simon, once we satisfice, get something that gets the job done. Once you get your hooks into the customer that way, that you're actually able to deliver something, you get on a ladder with your customer and you climb that ladder together. So they'll start saying, well, if you can do this, can you just make it more accurate? And by the way, can you see this? And can you see that? And the answer as an entrepreneur is, of course, yes. And so together you start going up this ladder of value. And I think a lot of technologists, what they want to do is they want to climb that ladder on behalf of their customers, come in with a fantastical solution. Two things happen, I think, two issues with that. One is they build things that they think are valuable. The customer it's not valuable to know that. Like that satisfies mild curiosity for me, but it doesn't help me make a better decision. This helps me make a better decision. Can you do this? Once you get them on that ladder and you find that they can make this decision safely with your technology, then they move towards a more sophisticated, advanced. Think of the first cell phones, even the first smartphones. 2007, first Apple iPhone. Put that in the hands of somebody now, and they think they're, working with an antique.
Yeah.
It wouldn't satisfy their needs. But in 2007, it exceeded what their expectations were. But not so much so that it was this crazy, but it was just at that moment of yes. We had experience with computers. It wasn't that different. We had used flip phones. It wasn't that different. And together they had arrived on that same spot. And once they started using it, Apple and their customers started climbing that ladder together.
Yeah. And to get there, something you said probably about 5-10 minutes ago, it's about talking to your end customer and getting objective perspectives on the problem you're trying to solve. Because I just keep thinking about how you said, when you went in saying, hey, do you have an inspection problem? That really didn't resonate. You kind of had to, is it asking better questions? What would you say the right way to getting to where you needed to be?
I think it's listening, and it's you almost have to be. Still not sure I'm very good at this, but I try. Is you're listening for sort of the things that are like incongruous, that just sort of don't make sense in a sense. Well, and what will happen is they'll say, well, we don't inspect, or we inspect, and then you say, well, okay, can you tell me a little bit more about what your inspection regime looks like? Who does it, when, why, how? And then as you listen, you start to hear incongruities. It's like, in your mind you're thinking, well, that's not what I would call inspection. I thought you were actually counting grapes. But you're not. You're actually doing this other thing. And you're not actually looking at the things that I thought you would look at. So then you'd say, hey, help me reconcile something in my mind here. I thought that you would be doing this and not that. Mm-hmm. And then usually when you get to that second and third order question, is truths interesting, is like, oh, so that's how she grows grapes.
Yeah.
Oh wow, I didn't even know that. There were moments with our customers where, I'll give you an example with blueberries. You never thought you'd be talking about blueberries in this interview, I'm
You'd
sure.
be surprised.
Okay.
Yeah, we go down many directions on the show.
Right. So we had some of the largest blueberry growers in the world, and among them, I won't name the company, but they're global, but they have a big operation in northern Peru. And they would say, well, we use we like your system for harvest. And I thought, that's interesting, because usually all our inspections are earlier in the year, telling them what to do during the year, so they get big, fat harvests. But they're using it in harvest. And what I discovered is, this is a farm, one particular farm, to give you a sense of the scale of this farm, 100,000 people.
Man,
Or 10,000 people, 100,000. Okay. 10,000 people.
100,000 seemed a lot.
10,000 people work on this farm.
Still a lot.
10,000 people. And it didn't exist 10 years ago. This is just a massive blueberry farm. And even with that many people, they still have a sort of a labor shortage. And the nature of blueberries is, in South America, you're pretty close to the equator, so you're constantly growing and harvesting. You don't have the seasonal, once a season kind of thing that you would have in Sonoma or New York State or France. And so they're constantly harvesting. But at any point in time, a blueberry bush is manifesting all of its features at a given time. So there'll be blueberries ready to harvest, there'll be flowering. Mm-hmm. But you want to make sure you get the blueberries when they're ready. You have a harvest window that may only be a few days.
That makes sense.
So if you don't get the blueberries at that point in time, they're not very useful.
Yeah.
And the way they deploy it is, think of it as a military analogy. I've got this big battle space. I have to send the people to harvest to specific places at just the right time. I don't want to send people and waste their time, have them go to all the way to this part of the blueberry farm only to pick four blueberries. So when you scan, you can know exactly which bush which bush should be harvested. Mm-hmm. When the blueberry, the harvestable blueberries reach a certain threshold, harvest those blueberries. So you now know exactly where to send people at exactly the right moment to get the blueberries off the bush and harvest and sell them. So they would scan to do that, and then once harvested, they would scan immediately afterward to know how effective that harvesting of that bush was. Mm. Nobody in our company thought about that was a possible use of the technology.
Yeah.
We were able to sell the technology to some of our customers just with that capability alone. So what I say to folk is you and your customer are gonna discover value initially in your conversations and then continue to discover it, as you have that relationship.
These have been excellent stories, excellent examples. As we wrap up, I've got a couple quick questions for you, since
yes, sir.
I think we're running low on the clock here. But one question, this is, I think, really important. We're exploring how people are getting technology out of the lab and into the real world.
Yeah.
Because it's interesting, when people talk about Carnegie Mellon, sometimes like, oh, well, it's one of the most high-tech spots, right?
Yeah,
But it's not necessarily applied.
Yeah.
You have been very successcul at taking things out of the lab and into the real world. So how has that been possible here?
So I would say, and that's one of the virtues of Carnegie Mellon is it's so advanced. It's well ahead of other universities where they're maybe in the more applied space. I mean, they're working on science fiction here. That's also its vice.
Yeah.
Is that it's a ways, and so and this is just me personally, is I look for something that is a novel application, a novel. Let's put it this way: and this is just creative part of entrepreneurship. Is I see hammers of various shapes and sizes made with different materials, to use that analogy, and I'm mindful of that. And then I think about problems where if this magic hammer could be adapted and adopted, could it maybe address this problem? And then I set about to understand the problem as I think it exists, and then revisit the concept of that hammer that I remembered, versus saying, I'm going to make this freaking hammer useful somehow. I'm going to just squeeze it into a product, and it's going to work.
Yeah. That's
a horrible way to do it. It's more you're of two minds, and you're trying to sort of fuse these concepts in a creative way. And that's, let's face it, entrepreneurs, that's what you get paid to do, is be creative. If you can't do that, you're going to struggle. So you have to want to do that too. That has to be something that's satisfying. The idea that I can see all these magical hammers, I can imagine all these different problems, and then I can sort of fuse them in some clever way.
Yeah. All right. Well, in addition to CMU, I do think there's something unique about the community and the vibe here in Pittsburgh, and that's something that we've been exploring.
Yeah.
Like, what's the community like here in your own words?
Yeah.
How does something like Pittsburgh Robotics Network play into this and help you?
I think for context's sake, I think people have to understand the history of Pittsburgh, and it's a long one. In fact, there's a guy, David McCullough, who Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, who's actually from Pittsburgh, and he's written a number of historical renderings of the United States. Very, very prominent American historian. He said, "Look, if I had to choose one city to describe the history of the United States, if I had to choose one city, one location, I would choose Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, because it's existed even before the Revolution. It goes back to the early 1700s. It was a French fort called Fort Duquesne that ultimately became Fort Pitt when the British took it over. Mm-hmm. So there's a long, long history of this city, and it was an industrial city in the 1820s, 1830s. It was a glass manufacturing center of the then United States. And it's had a history of being kind of industrial core. During the Civil War, it was the arsenal for the Union Army during that time. And subsequent in the history, it's been an industrial community and then existed for probably 200 plus years until such time as the probably 70s, when the world changed. With globalization, the price of steel, and there were other industries here as well, and there was Pittsburgh went into what I would call a rapid decline. To give you a sense of that, in 1960, the population of the city was nearly 700,000. It's now 320.
Well, it's like everything that was going on then was playing directly against Pittsburgh's strengths.
Now, one of the wonderful things that the early citizens of this city had decided to do was found some great universities, including Carnegie Mellon, which used to be called Carnegie Tech, and believed that technology was the key to the future of the United States. Fortunately, these universities still exist and are now the center of growth for the future of the city. There was a time, I'd say, starting in the 80s through the early 2000s, when the city was in rapid decline, and it became a very old city. And by that I mean the average age of the citizen of Pittsburgh, I think at one point, was one of the oldest cities, average age in the United States, I think second oldest. As that generation fades into history, what's happening now is, interestingly, is it's a college town.
Mm-hmm.
Is the average age is dropping.
Yeah.
This is a young person's city.
Yeah.
With all the vibrancy and opportunity that one would expect to see. It used to be 20 years ago when I came here that people would develop a technology, get a degree, and head west or east or somewhere other than here. That's less the case. And so people are saying, why do I need to go to Silicon Valley? I can get money. I kind of like it here. And so I'm starting to see, particularly over the last 5 years, a city that's being reborn. And I think what a lot of the well-meaning people did in this community is they kept looking around as the city was in decline and saying, we should be like Boston, or we should be like Austin, or pick your city.
Mm-hmm.
I think eventually people gave up on that idea and said, we should be more like who we are.
Yeah.
So I think the good news for Pittsburgh is Pittsburgh ain't like any place in the world. It's authentic. Mm-hmm. It is what it is. Mostly good, a few not great things, but mostly good. And technology has been one of the sources of that energy. Now, the technology industry in this city isn't as big as one would hope it to be, but it's growing.
Yeah.
And it's on the map. And when it comes to robotics and robotic technology, it's one of the few places in the world that people can point to and say, there's a lot going on there. Mm-hmm. Cities 4, 5, 6, 10 times bigger than the city can't make that claim. So maybe is this Detroit is Pittsburgh, Detroit, 1905? Maybe. We just need to find our Ms. or Mr. Ford out there to advance this city further.
I like how I've never thought of it this way, but Pittsburgh kind of really is now the world's largest college town, right? Because you have a few colleges here that are so notable, so large. Yep. I feel the energy in this place. It's been a great spot for us to explore. I do look forward to seeing how this evolves. And I think there's a self-awareness that cities need to have where it's like, oh, we're going to be the next Silicon Valley. We're going to be the next Boston, Austin, insert city here, right?
We're going to be the best Pittsburgh we can be.
That's the right attitude. So I could talk to you all day, but I'm going to wrap it up with one question because you have a lot of experience. You've been in a number of interviews before. What's a question you never get asked? Something you'd want to talk about, maybe that might be relevant to this audience that you're like, gosh, I wish other people would bring this up.
Why do I have Steve McQueen as my picture in my Zoom channel?
I don't know if I noticed that. Is that what you had? Is that really what it is?
That he was when I was a kid. That's how old I am. When I was a kid, Steve McQueen was my hero. For those younger people who don't know who Steve McQueen is, he was a big Hollywood star back in the day. And my favorite movie was a film called Bullet, which was a detective movie in the late 70s. It was one of the first chase scenes in the history of cinema. Like probably one of the best car chase scenes in the world. So I was a kid at that time. And there's a funny story about it. He made a movie. He was himself an avid racer of cars and motorcycles, etc. And he made a film called Le Mans, and it was the 24 Hours of Le Mans. It's still a great film, one of the greatest race car films of all time. One of the few films to actually use real cars and cameras and all that.
Yeah.
And there's a picture of him in his racing suit, and I took that as a picture of me, Steve McQueen. I should be so honored to be, And somebody said, why do you have a picture of Neil Armstrong in your... And I said, no, he's not an astronaut. That's a racing suit, and it's not Neil Armstrong. It's Steve McQueen. So that's the question of why do you have Steve McQueen? And I thought, maybe I should change that picture because not everybody knows who Steve McQueen is. let alone Neil Armstrong, but that's fine.
At least we've gotten the oral truth here on Made Here.
Oh, you got it on
here
record,
on Manufacturing Happy Hour today. Well, what a fun way to end this conversation. So, hey, Mark, like I said, just incredible from start to finish. I've learned a lot from this. I know our audience is going to learn a lot from it as well. So thanks so much for taking the time.
I appreciate the opportunity, and thanks for having me.
Cheers.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you.